on another subject, Madam President. Dealing with my oversight work, on March the 10th of this year, I came to the floor about my February 11th, 2021 oversight letter to the Biden administration's Department of Homeland Security. That letter discussed the administration's withdrawal of what's been called the Confucius rule, associated with the country of China and probably more closely related to the Communist Party of China. Now, the rule that was withdrawn was proposed in the Trump administration, and it would have required additional institutions to just simply disclose their financial connection to the Communist Chinese government, including its Confucius Institute. The substance of the rule is common sense, especially in light of the clear propaganda threat that the regime of China presents to us. It's common sense. So why wouldn't the Biden administration continue with it? In my letter, I asked Secretary Mayorkas two very simple questions. One, does the Biden administration of Homeland Security consider Confucius Institutes to be an extension of the Communist Chinese government? If not, why not? Second question, does the Biden Department of Homeland Security consider Confucius Institutes to be purveyors of Communist Chinese propaganda? If not, why not? When I took to the floor March the 10th, the Biden administration had failed to respond. As of today, still no response. These are various, very easy questions for the administration. The failure to answer in light of ongoing threat is very troubling. Just the other week, the Justice Department indicted an American professor with 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of making false statements for concealing support he received from the Chinese government. The indictment tells me the administration has concerns about China and our universities, or this action would not have been taken. During the course of my oversight activities, I've looked at both threats to taxpayer-funded research and threats that Confucius Institutes pose to our educational institution. Simply put, these are real concerns. With respect to threats to taxpayer-funded research, we must protect our intellectual property and research. Chinese are stealing our intellectual property every day. We all know that. We spend billions of dollars and expend a great amount of effort to bring innovations to this country and in turn the world. We must protect our American investments from Chinese espionage and theft. Likewise, we must guard against the propaganda spread by Confucius Institutes, which are extensions of the communist regime. One member of the communist regime said this, and I quote, "The Confucius Institute is an appealing brand for expanding our culture abroad. It has made an important contribution towards improving our soft power. The Confucius brand has a natural attractiveness. Using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical. End of that quote. Now I want to quote the Chinese Minister of Propaganda said to his fellow ministry workers, quote, coordinate the efforts of overseas and domestic propaganda and further create a favorable international environment for us with regard to key issues that influence our sovereignty and safety. We should actively carry out international propaganda battles against issues such as Tibet, Taiwan, human rights. Our strategy is to proactively take our culture abroad. We should do well in establishing and operating overseas cultural centers and Confucius institutes. Why would any American doubt China's purpose for Confucius institutes based upon the quote of that minister? Yet even with this very clear threat, the Biden administration is silent on the proposed rule, other than they're getting caught retracting that Trump rule. What's more does this administration need before they get the picture? Given the administration's failure to act, I've introduced a bill, S. 1369, that would make the rule that they've withdrawn now a law. My bill, which is co-sponsored by Senators Blackburn, Tillis, and Hawley, would require United States educational institutions to disclose their financial connections with the communist Chinese regime. My bill would accomplish these measures by requiring those schools to disclose those connections as part of their certification and recertification of student aid exchange visitors program. That program provides approvals to schools to enroll non-immigrant students. If the schools want visas for these foreign students, they'll first have to disclose their ties to the Chinese government. The centerpiece of the bill I just described is disclosure and transparency, and we all know that transparency brings accountability. We, the people, absolutely have a right to know if our educational institutions are tied to the hip with China, especially in light of that regime's using money to gain leverage over many of them. Which brings me then to a greater point. American educational institutions ought to stand up to the communist regime instead of doing their bidding for the millions of dollars that they receive. China is a national security threat. They're a propaganda machine, and we know they will stop at nothing in their attempt to dominate the world. It's time for the Biden administration to step up to the plate and protect our American interests and American institutions. And if they don't let that rule of the previous administration stay in place or put it back in place, I would urge my colleagues to join my transparency bill.